Hi everyone, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 16th, where I wanted to put some closure on Halloween and move us to our next film, which happens to be The Blair Witch Project. I also wanted to remind you that next week is Thanksgiving, so we are not meeting. And I can tell you that the semester tends to move pretty quickly after Thanksgiving. So I wanted to start by reminding you about our final project, which is due at the ending of the semester, but certainly you can hand in your project earlier. And at this point, you should be working on your final project. I, of course, invite all of you to send me drafts and questions. And that said, the idea behind the final project is a way that you can examine an element about horror film and media and popular culture in additional depth. So one of the things you'll see in our notes below is that I have included some examples of how to go about quoting if you are using outside resources. You don't necessarily have to use outside resources, but if you do use outside resources, we are using the MLA system, or the Modern Language Association system, which is what you use in the humanities and in all of the languages. And basically what you do is you use parentheses immediately following a quote. Whether the sentence is completed or not is irrelevant. And within those parentheses, you put the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to determine where that quote could be found. And then at the very ending of your paper, you would include a works cited page that lists all of the works that you literally have cited or quoted throughout the paper. And this is where you give all of the detail about each of those works. And they're all listed by author's last name in alphabetical order. But in terms of parenthetical documentation, you'll see again in section 4 that I've given you some examples that punctuation goes after the documentation. So I gave you an example of, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, which actually happens to be from a short story from Ernest Hemingway. So at the ending of college, that's the ending of the quote. So I put my closing quote marks, and then I open parentheses and I put the page number and close parentheses and then have my ending punctuation. Notice I don't write anything inside of the parentheses, such as the word page or PG or anything of that nature. And the assumption is that the way that this particular quote would have appeared in a paper, that it would have been clear which text you are referencing for page 162. So that means that you wouldn't need to add any additional information in the parentheses. Let's say, for instance, that you had identified the text in your opening paragraph. However, that isn't always the case. And if that's not the case, that it's not clear to the reader which text you are referencing, then you need to add additional information. For instance, it might be the author's surname and the page number. That might be sufficient so that if a reader were to go to the works cited page, they could look up the author by their surname. However, if you've got multiple texts by the same author, then surname isn't going to be enough. So then you would add part of the title. So I've included 2 links that you might want to reference to refresh your memory in terms of parenthetical documentation, which is something that I hope that you had discussed in English 101, which is a prerequisite for this course. But if, again, it's something that you're hazy about, one website that I very much recommend is Purdue OWL, and it happens to be put out by Purdue University, but they've made it public to everyone. And you can see that I've included the link below in that 4th section, and they will go through the entire process of writing, right from generating ideas to what a final copy should look like before you submit it in, and everything in between, including quotation. And also, the GCC library has information about writing and citation, and I've included that link as well because the library is quite aware that you are probably going to be writing research papers. And there are quite a few formats that you can use when you are writing papers. And again, we are using the MLA, or the Modern Language Association system. But there are other systems such as the APA, the American Psychological Association, which is what you would use for the sciences, but we aren't the sciences. To continue on, I wanted to give you an example of a sentence where the sentence continues. It doesn't end after the quote, what that would look like. So sentence continuation after documentation. Although, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. And then you can see in the notes below in section 4, I've opened up my parentheses, put the number 162 because that's the page number, close the parentheses, and then continue on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother, and then end my sentence the way I normally would. If I wanted to insert my own language, I could do that with square brackets inside of a quote. Usually we do that to clarify something. It's akin to interrupting somebody when they're speaking, so you want to try not to do that. Oftentimes it's to clarify a pronoun. So if you're using his or her and it's not clear what that pronoun or who that pronoun is referencing, what his or what her, based on the quotation that you've selected, well then you can insert in that additional information in square brackets. Note, not parentheses. So the example that I've included for an insertion is, quote, even his, and then in square brackets is Krebs's, and then close square brackets. So this is my insertion that was not part of the original quote. Lies were not sensational, unquote, and then I've got, again, the parentheses with the 162. So again, if you feel that it's absolutely necessary to interrupt the quote, that's how you could do that. Again, not for analysis of the quote. You can always do that after the quote or perhaps even before the quote. You can also omit something from a quote, not because you want to change its meaning, but purely because it just isn't relevant. And then you would use a piece of punctuation called an ellipsis, and perhaps it's more fondly known as the 3 periods or the 3 dots. And there's an example again below. Krebs, comma, quote, during his time, dot, 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 or period, was sleeping late in bed, unquote. And then I've got the parenthetical documentation afterwards. So that means that I left out a word or several words that just wouldn't be relevant. If you're quoting over 3 lines of text, not 3 sentences, but 3 lines of text, you would use a block quote. And basically what that means is that you would indent in your quote so that it appears as a block. So it's sectioned off in that particular instance. So again, I'm hopeful that this is review, and you may or may not need this information. As you know, there are lots of ways that you could proceed with the final project. This would be applicable, let's say, if you were writing a paper, but if you were doing something a little bit more creative, it may not necessarily be that applicable. So again, it just depends on your project, but feel free to reach out to me because we're at the point of the semester now where I'm hopeful that you are working on your project. And what we've done all semester long was basically reviewed horror films from a historical perspective and talked about how they could reflect media and popular culture, and perhaps more importantly, how they reflect some of the anxieties of their particular time period. So how we could read them symbolically or metaphorically. And notice that I use the term read even though we watch a film, because you can read a film as carefully as you would read a piece of literature. And we began, of course, with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and we talked about all of the anxieties in German society about the aftermath of World War I and how well that film seemed to portray some of those anxieties. And then we talked about Dracula, and while The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is considered to be the first feature-length horror film, Dracula is considered to be the first American horror film, and how that seemed to reflect in the 1930s many of the anxieties of America in terms of the idea of other and reverse colonialism and colonization. And then in the 1940s, we talked about cat people and some of the anxieties about the increasing power of female in the world. And then in the 1950s, and we talked about Invasion of the Body Snatchers and the paranoia that was associated politically, but also rather literally with the suspicion that space aliens had actually landed in the 1947 Roswell, New Mexico space landing. And the 1960s being a particularly tumultuous time, and that Psycho does a wonderful examination of what happens when you isolate the nuclear family unit. It leads to a mental distress and mental illness, as we saw with Norman. But also in the 1960s, we saw Night of the Living Dead, and the sense of futility of relying on past authoritarian institutions like government or police or media, and just the inability of the population to find a way to work with one another. And the consequence would basically be Armageddon on one level or another. And then when we get to the 1970s, we talked about the fear of the youth culture when we talked about The Exorcist, where children were openly engaging in drug use and abuse, as well as teens. And there was also the protest movement and lots of political protests going on as well, where parents didn't recognize their children anymore. It seemed like they were monstrosities, which seemed to work so nicely in terms of what we're discussing with Regan MacNeil. And as I had said, that film is so often misread that in the end it's about the exorcists themselves and their inner demons and how they struggle with them. And when we get to the 1980s, I cheated a little bit by providing a film from 1978, but it helped to really establish that slasher movement from the 1980s, and that's Halloween. And what we see in Halloween is the continued collapse of the nuclear family. We started seeing this in the 60s, and definitely we've seen this come to a head in the 1980s. And the idea that looking and gazing, which was established in Psycho, is also something that's reflected in Halloween. The irony, because of course we as audience members are looking and gazing, and just the way that so much of society had turned to screens, not computer screens at that point. It would have been television screens and film screens, in order to interact with the world and the negative consequences of that. And seeing the murderer's view, affiliating us with the murderer, could perhaps lead to some of the scholarship that was done about Michael being a kind of Reagan era conservative pushback against some of the extremes that occurred in the 60s and the 70s, and that ultimately Michael is exacting retribution on those who are engaging in sexual promiscuity and smoking marijuana, against some of the concerns of the 1970s of the youth culture, and that yes, it's the virginal good girl, so to speak, the final girl who lives. But again, gender is so interesting over the course of this entire semester. And certainly we have a strong female who survives, but a female who's brutalized throughout the course of the film. Definitely we see this critique of suburbia. No place is safe. We saw this beginning with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and that ultimately what seemed to be the idyllic suburbs offered no protection from the other. And then again, we reference that again in the 1960s, the 1970s. It doesn't matter if you've got wealth and privilege, as we saw in the 1970s with the MacNeil family. And we also see this, I think, in terms of where we are in this particular time period, that Halloween takes place in a very idyllic setting, but yet it's where Michael Myers comes from and where he exacts his revenge. Perhaps in part because of this, again, a Reagan-esque push about what happens when there are absentee parents and youth culture is basically left to its own devices. Even though John Carpenter says that wasn't necessarily his initial concern when he was filming the film, I think that definitely we could read the film from that perspective, as well as the idea of repression and sexual frustration, which perhaps is a motivation for Michael engaging in his first murder against his sister, who spends her time being sexually promiscuous rather than watching him as she was instructed to do, trying to take the role of the parent. But of course, a teenager can never substitute for parent. So, in terms of thinking about Halloween, I think that the inhumanity of murderers, this idea of the boogeyman or the inhuman, or some of you have even suggested how Michael Myers gives us the sense of the serial killer, and how what it might be like to see through the eyes of a serial killer behind the mask, so to speak. And from my perspective, I of course appreciate the supernatural possibilities. Definitely, it's very gothic. The pumpkin was had folklore associated that it was used to light the way in the netherworld. A place that was neither heaven nor hell. An Irish myth. There was a boy named Jack who basically had angered the devil to the point that the devil didn't want Jack's soul when Jack died as an old man. And God certainly didn't want Jack's soul. So both of them, God and the devil, offered Jack some illumination, some lighting for his way. And the way that in the netherworld, since he could go to neither heaven nor hell. And that was known as Jack's Lantern or Jack-o'-lantern. And you can see how that's related to some of our current lore associated with Halloween, that light of the jack-o'-lantern is supposed to light the way in the netherworld and keep away evil. And of course, those jack-o'-lanterns are lit, but that doesn't keep away the human evil of Michael Myers. Particularly if we want to think of Michael Myers as a symbol that evil can never be killed, and that oftentimes it doesn't have an explanation or a motivation. That indeed there is a boogeyman, and the boogeyman is us, which is an idea that we have seen before in films like Night of the Living Dead. And just to give you an idea of its incredible popularity, usually a film is based on a text. For Halloween, it was the other way around, that a mass market paperback was written after the film, before the film, just to show the kind of importance this film had. So when we moved to the 1990s, I selected the Blair Witch Project. I think in many ways it was very prophetic for its time in terms of the influence of technology and the influence of media. Think about the 1990s, probably one of the most seminal events of the 1990s was the birth of the internet that has completely changed our conception of society. That said, we don't necessarily have the internet in this film, though they use the internet quite cleverly in that they had a media campaign that basically promoted the film as if it was a real life event. This is a mockumentary. It's a very meta kind of film. It's a film about making a film. And it is also what led to the very popular found footage film movement of today. When we think about this faux documentary or mockumentary, I think one of the reasons why this film has a sense of realism is because so much method acting was used. Many times the actors were told to improvise, and in fact, they were deprived of food, and oftentimes the directors would try to scare them in the middle of the night. They actually did sleep in those tents at night in order to get realistic performances. And it's very similar to the idea of the slasher film that you have to isolate the characters and then you eliminate them by some sort of dehumanizing force. And I think we've seen that in horror film throughout this semester, that one of the main messages is the importance of community, that once you start to isolate, then ultimately you become vulnerable. But this independent film that was done on a shoestring budget, $60,000, which is nothing really, earned over $250 million. So it was an incredible success. Basically, it was a group of film students who got together and maxed out their credit cards. I don't advise that you do that. But obviously, the profits justify the risk that they took. And this sense of needing to record everything and that something isn't real unless it is recorded, I think is very much an indicator of where we are now with the internet and with social media. Not that social media was a force at this particular time. The idea of what is reality and how do we perceive reality. The movie techniques try to mimic reality. We've got this shaky camera that leads to a good sense of audience physical discomfort. People oftentimes experienced queasy stomachs, myself included, in the theater. I first saw this in a theater. I tend to suffer a little bit from motion sickness. The idea was to not only give us a sense of realism, but also to provide a sense of physical discomfort so that we could feel much what the main characters are feeling as well. Not that I want to give away too many spoilers at this point. And this idea that technology can record reality truth, but also distort it. And again, when we think about the fake news movement, I think, again, the Blair Witch Project was rather prophetic for its time. The technological uncanny, we've been talking about the uncanny, that which is similar to and yet different from reality, which is basically what recording does. And at one point, one of the characters, his name is Josh, he tells the other character, the filmmaker, Heather, as she's filming everything that's going on, I see why, this is a quote, I see why you like this video camera so much. It's not really quite reality. It's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is. And we definitely will see the misunderstandings and the solitude that is brought about by this over-reliance on technology. Again, very ahead of its time when we think about some of our current issues with technology. That filtered film reality is really the only thing that character Heather, as a filmmaker, has left. But technology cannot protect against the horrors of the natural world, which I think you will see when you watch the film. Themes that we've seen before in other films, sanity and insanity. This film is very subtle. It's ambiguous and suggestive that we basically fear what we don't see or the unknown. In fact, the occult basically means unknown. We'll also see the tension between wilderness and civilization. Wilderness always wins in this instance. And a question to perhaps think about. Does the victim, through their hubris, their arrogance, their pursuit, empower the monster actually by seeking it out? Again, this question will make sense once you've watched the film, which mixes the past, this idea of myth and ancient fears, also with the present, or the present for the 1990s, and I say technology. So, for today's attendance question, which would be due on Friday, November 18th at 6 p.m., how do you think the Blair Witch Project represents the 1990s in America? I know that it's quite possible that you weren't born during the 1990s. I was actually an adult in the 1990s, albeit a very young adult. And I've always seen this as a reflection of that particular time period because I lived through it. But you probably are aware of the 90s from more of a historical perspective. So from that lens, how do you think the Blair Witch Project represents 1990s America? So the link is below. Luckily, I was able to find the link. I hope you enjoy the Blair Witch Project. And we will continue on next class, but do keep in mind that next class, the 23rd, is going to be Thanksgiving, though I will also post something on our Moodle site indicating that we're not meeting on that date. So our class will be the following week. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.